So, the last movie covered simple access in PLSQL, adding select, insert, update, and delete statements into PLSQL blocks of code. Now you have something called a cursor. A cursor is basically where you create a record structure, a data type, which includes the entire record or parts thereof, into a PLSQL block, and you can actually scan through it. There are two types of cursors. An explicit cursor means that it's there, you define it explicitly, specifically. An implicit one means that PLSQL Oracle may do some of the definition of that for you. The easiest way is to explain the explicit cursor first, because it tells you what's going on. So an explicit cursor gives you program control. It gives you access to each row specifically. An implicit cursor may not necessarily allow that. Explicit cursors must be declared physically in the code. They have to be opened, each row must be fetched to be processed, and then they have to be closed. If you leave something open and you don't close it, you could have some problems with things hanging around in memory and causing problems later on. They can be created generically as well within the code, but implicit cursors can as well. Personally, when coding, I don't use explicit cursors anymore. I generally use implicit cursors all the time, and I can get by with them. And they're more efficient, more effective. They rely more on Oracle as opposed to actually programming the cursor itself. You can also pass explicit cursors as biref parameters, which you can't actually do with an implicit cursor, which is the only benefit of using an explicit cursor. But as a programmer, I might want to ask myself why I would want to pass a cursor into and out of a procedure in a parameter. That's taking a huge, potentially a huge chunk of data or memory and passing it into and out of a subset piece of code. I don't know if that's such a good idea. It kind of feels kind of messy to me. But let's go and look at example explicit cursors quickly. So this is explicit cursor use. And here's another aspect of DBMS output. I'm enabling the buffer size. I'm not actually sure what the default size is. I think it's about 1,000. This is 1,000,000. This is 1,000,000 bytes. It means that when DBMS output runs out of space in the buffer, it stops producing output. All the output commands will be executed inside here, but the output only actually comes out into SQL Plus when this block of code is finished. So if this buffer here actually fills up inside the DBMS output thing, you'll get it chopped off the number of characters in the buffer. So this is useful if you want to pull a lot of information out. But bear in mind, putting out too much information can be a problem. 1,000,000 characters or 1,000,000 bytes is the maximum size. You make it too big, the thing's going to be too slow, it's going to fill up memory, probably crash your database. And here, all I'm doing here is I'm creating, as you can see here, a cursor explicitly against the ACT table, against a query. 2 columns from the ACT table, which happens to be 2 columns anyway. And then I'm defining a record against the ACT table. Then I'm saying, go and open this cursor, loop through it, fetch each row, and exit when it's not found, and then dump it out onto the screen, and then close it at the end. I've commented out the rollback, and I've commented out the raise, because I don't really need it. So generally that's what's going to be in an exception loop, but in this case, we're not actually changing any data, we're just outputting a result. So the simple and logical thing would be to close the cursor. So first of all, let's go and do these commands: connect, put in the set server output on, and enable output to be a large buffer. What I'm really doing here is showing you how to code an explicit cursor. And let's run it to be sure it works. And as you can see, it actually works. So the code is correct. We can also do generic code. A generic piece of code is basically something that generates something else within something else. It's like data about data about data, in many layers, if you like. All we're doing here is we're actually creating a ref cursor for the table. Then we're creating the cursor there without the SQL statement. And in here, we're applying the SQL statement and pushing it into here. So it's just a different way of doing exactly the same thing, but we're generating the statement inside the block of code itself rather than in the declare. And now here we can actually use a parameter where we pass a parameter into a stored procedure, and we tell the query generically inside the stored procedure to look for a pattern. Obviously, in the non-generic version up here, I can't pass a where clause variable into this select statement here. I can only do that because this is actually declared within the declare section. It's not executed here. So down here, what I'm actually doing is I'm passing a pattern in and applying it to the query inside the procedure itself. So you're getting a generic decision as to what you actually want to pull from the database. So if you did this here and you only want to pull things that start with a capital A, you'll get things that start with a capital A. And obviously the same applies to there, Chicago, and then null, you get nothing, essentially. That effectively demonstrates use of explicit cursors and gives you various options for using them, and most importantly gives you some example code that you can use later on. At this point, this code all works, which is very useful, I find myself.